Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I am here today at the Rock Island Auction Company checking out some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming April of 2016 premiere auction. And today I have a really cool gun that failed to become the M1 Carbine. This is a second pattern Bendix-Hyde carbine. So most people are probably familiar with the M1 Carbine, but we'll go over a little bit of the history first to put this in proper context. In October of 1940, the U.S. military decided that they really wanted to investigate, they wanted a light rifle. They actually called this the light rifle program. Kind of like they would call another light rifle program after World War II. Anyway, what they wanted specifically was a gun that was chambered for the .30 carbine cartridge, which had already been developed by Winchester. They wanted it to be effective out to 300 yards. They wanted it to weigh no more than 5 pounds. They wanted it to use detachable magazines and to be either semi or fully automatic. And this request for proposals went out in October of 1940, and the first trials were held in May of 1941. So only 7 or 8 months of development time available. Despite which, they got a whole slew of interested competitors, mostly companies, but there was at least one group of just private inventors who submitted a carbine. Among these competitors, there were 9 in total. John Garand submitted a prototype carbine. Val Browning, the son of John Browning, John Moses Browning, submitted a carbine proposal. And along with, let's see, the Reising, Eugene Reising and the Reising Company submitted one. The Auto-Ordnance Company that was making the Thompsons submitted one. Springfield Arsenal submitted both they submitted 2. One was John Garand's and one was from another designer. Really, this was just like everybody who was anybody in American firearms development was interested in this project because it wasn't necessarily a technically difficult thing. It wasn't a real high-pressure cartridge. And it was an obvious military contract because war is imminent at this point. October 1940, the world is devolving into war. So one of the designers that was involved was a guy named George Hyde. He worked for the Bendix Aircraft Company, which originally made aircraft parts. George Hyde is one of those guys he was a really good designer. He was talented and knowledgeable, and he actually had his hands in a number of successful projects, but his name isn't well known today. Probably the best known gun that he was responsible for was the M3 grease gun, the US M3 submachine gun, which would be developed a little bit later in World War II to replace the Thompson. A sheet metal stamped gun. You might think of it as the American take on the Sten gun. It's not really, but same idea. They were trying to reduce cost a lot. At any rate, George Hyde puts together his own proposal for a light rifle in .30 carbine, and it was actually pretty good. It was one of the better submissions in this first, this May of 1941 trial. It weighed 5.3 pounds. By the way, for you European folks, the 5-pound weight limit is like 2.27 kilos. So Hyde's gun was 5.3 pounds, which is just over the limit. In fact, all of the competitors were a little bit over the 5-pound weight limit. Nobody managed to actually break 5 pounds. So despite the fact that they were all a little bit over, the Ordnance Department accepted a bunch of the designs regardless. Anyway, Hyde's carbine, it was select fire, so semi and full auto, and it actually did really well in the testing. It was found to be quite accurate. It went through things like the reliability dust test very well. They liked it. They had a couple complaints about it. It had a pistol grip, and they actually, the Ordnance Department requested that that be changed to a traditional stock like this. The bolt handle could pull the bolt backwards, but it didn't allow you to positively push the bolt forward. And the Ordnance Department asked them to change that, and they wanted a stronger recoil spring in it. Apparently it felt a bit sluggish. It's interesting they wanted a stronger recoil spring, and yet the gun seemed to work just fine. So anyway, a second trial was announced for the following September of 1941. So this is a pretty short time frame. And what's really interesting is the Winchester Company, which ended up winning, had not submitted anything. They didn't have a rifle ready to submit to this first trial. At this point, the Winchester Company was busy just getting started tooling up for its first major production run of M1 Garand rifles, which they were also a contractor for. So after the first trial, when it's announced that there will be a second trial, Winchester realizes that they might yet still have a shot at this. And so they put together an absolute crash development program to design their own light rifle entrant. And it turns out they took a total of 34 days and put together the rifle that would win the trials. There's a bit of misunderstanding about this, thanks to Hollywood in particular. The Winchester rifle was a product of an entire development team. One element of it was the gas tappet system that it used, which was designed by a guy named David Marshall Williams, aka Carbine Williams. And according to Hollywood, he designed the whole thing from a prison cell. This is pretty much bunk. Williams was a Winchester employee. He had indeed designed and invented that gas tappet system, but he didn't really have anything to do with the rest of the rifle. This really was a team product from Winchester's development group. Anyway, to go back to George Hyde for a moment, because after all it's his gun that we're looking at here, he made a number of the requested design changes and resubmitted his rifle for the September of 1941 testing. And unfortunately, it kind of did worse. That redesigned rifle is in fact what we have here today. They got rid of the full auto capability, so it's semi-automatic only, which is kind of handy for us today. It means this isn't a more heavily regulated firearm. They got rid of the pistol grip and went back to a traditional stock. They added, you could call it a forward assist, it's not really, but the bolt handle now reciprocates with the bolt and allows you to positively push the bolt forward. And presumably the recoil spring is in fact stiffer. Unfortunately, in the process of making these design changes, he tweaked some other things, and this rifle turned out to be worse in testing and worse in the eyes of the Ordnance Department than his first model. So specifically, it had some reliability problems in testing, which the first one hadn't, and it was actually more difficult to disassemble than the first one. And we'll see that in just a moment when we take it apart. It really is kind of an obnoxious gun to take apart. Not what you would want for a military rifle. So that was pretty much the end of this project for Hyde, and in fact for everybody else who had submitted light rifle prototypes, because, of course, the Winchester submission, which did become the M1 Carbine, was found by the testing board to pretty much be hands down the best of the rifles. At any rate, let's get a closer look at this second pattern of Hyde carbine, because only 5 of these were ever made. And I should point out, they're actually, interestingly, they were made by the Inland Corporation, which would go on to be one of the major contractors for Winchester-designed M1 carbines. So this rifle was originally submitted to trials with a 20-round magazine, which unfortunately is not here, missing with this rifle. It's not a standard M1 carbine magazine. It looks like you could probably adapt an M1 carbine magazine to fit, but it'd take a little bit of work. Now, Winchester clearly took inspiration from the M1 Garand. Obviously, just before they designed this rifle, they were setting up production of the M1, and with their time frame, it makes perfect sense that they would take what elements they could from the M1. So we have a long stroke gas piston coming down right here, comes under the handguard, which I'll pull off for you in just a moment, attaches to this operating rod, which travels all the way back with the bolt. And then we have a bolt here, which has a tilting wedge to lock back here in the action. In light of the 300-yard maximum effective range, this carbine has a 2-position rear flip aperture sight. Nice and simple, lightweight, easy to do. And it has a nice, simple, half-round front post. No sight hood, nothing else. Not adjustable. In fact, neither of these sights are adjustable in any way, other than having the 2 different apertures, which give you different ranges, presumably something like 100 and 300 yards, I suspect. Other than that, they get zeroed at the factory, and then there's no adjustment. That's exactly the right way to do a rifle like this, I think. The safety was also cribbed from the M1. Works exactly the same way. Into the trigger guard, puts it on safe, and then you push it forward, and you're ready to fire. The trigger looks kind of awkward, but it does actually work. It goes more up than back. To disassemble, we're going to start at the front end, and we're going to take this sling swivel and unthread it. That is the screw that holds the front handguard on. So there's that. And then the front handguard slides forward and then kind of off like so. It's a rather large forend here. It's got this one metal attachment in it, and this tab locks into the receiver right here. That holds it in place, along with the sling swivel screw in the front. which screws into this lug. Next up, we can take out the recoil spring. Rather like the M1 Garand, this recoil spring goes into the operating rod. To take this out, we're just going to pull it back and then lift it up. So just like, there we go. That comes out. The spring is jammed nicely in there. There's our recoil spring. Now, before we can take the operating rod out, we have to move this sliding cover plate. And this is where disassembly really gets kind of wonky. So there's a spring-loaded pin here, and I have to push that pin in and then push the plate back. And this pin is far too small to be pushed in with the nose of a .30 carbine round nose bullet. You might be able to do it with a .30-06. I'm going to use a little punch here. And this is a pretty stiff plate. That's not necessarily true of all of them, but the one nice thing is there's a second hole in the plate here, so you don't pull this all the way off and lose it. It locks into position right here where you can do all your disassembly. Now, what we can do is pull the bolt and the operating rod back to here and then lift them out of the receiver track. So this lifts off, and now we can pull out the full-length operating rod. This looks very, very much like an M1, doesn't it? It has two lugs back here that interact with the bolt, and this is what keeps it reciprocating, and this actually also forces the bolt to positively lock into the receiver. We'll see that in just a moment. Next up, and we're almost done here, is to remove the trigger assembly. To do that, we're going to flip this over, and we have another one of these very small little pins. What I need to do is push that pin in, and then I can rotate the plate down. Again, this is too small for a carbine bullet tip. You could probably do it with an .06, but of course someone with a carbine wouldn't necessarily have an .06 round. So I've pushed that in and rotated it a little bit. Now we can pull it the rest of the way down, and at this point the trigger assembly lifts out. This trigger assembly is held in place in the front by this lip, and in the back by these two semicircular lugs. This rotates a round pin that has cutouts, so when it's in this position right here, trigger group can come out. In this position, it's locked firmly in place. And the last bit of our disassembly is the bolt. The bolt drops nicely out, and you can see that we have our locking wedge right here on the top of the bolt. So the way this works with the bolt is that you have these two lugs, and the rear lug is really the important one. The rear lug sits in this round piece, and what it does is when the bolt's all the way forward, it forces this locking shoulder up, which locks into the receiver, and then when the gas piston gets hit by a burst of gas when you fire, this goes backward, it pulls this round piece with it, and because the bolt is locked in this tight channel in the receiver, this pulls the locking wedge down and then cycles the whole thing backwards. So you're not just dependent on spring pressure or an angled surface in the receiver to drop the locking block. You actually have this op rod physically pulling it downwards. The rest of the bolt is pretty simple, really. We've got a firing pin, an extractor up here. The fire control group is it's a striker fired gun, so this guy right here is our striker for the firing pin. See that? And so this is the sear surface. It gets held back right here, and when you pull the trigger, you can see pulling the trigger drops that sear. When it's all the way pulled, the disconnector pops it back up so that it is only semi-automatic. And when you engage the safety, that blocks this from dropping down and prevents you from firing. Our locking recess is right here. Two separate locking shoulders, actually. Those are not interchangeable. Those are just milled into the receiver. So if the locking shoulder ever goes out of spec, the whole gun is out of spec. You have to replace, well, I suppose you could replace the locking wedge on the bolt. But it's also worth pointing out that there is what appears to be some type of fiber recoil pad buffer in the back of the receiver. Interesting that they would need that on a gun as light as .30 carbine, but it's probably because this receiver is just barely long enough for the full travel of the bolt to to eject and feed a new cartridge. And making the receiver longer to, say, soften the recoil impulse so the bolt didn't hit the back of the receiver, doing that would increase the weight, and the weight was a critical and difficult to meet requirement on this design. So that's probably why they went with a nice short receiver and a little recoil buffer pad at the back. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. There are very few of these prototype carbines from any of the manufacturers still floating around, so it's really cool to get a chance to take a look at one and delve into it and see how it works. This thing's in really excellent condition. The only thing it's missing is that magazine, and it would be a really sweet little gun. If you'd like to own it yourself, add it to a collection, and make a great counterpoint to an official adopted M1 carbine, well, take a look at the description text below, or above, I suppose, depending on how you're watching the video. You'll find a link there to Rock Island's catalog page on this rifle. You can take a look at their pictures and their description and place a bid for it right there online, or come up to the auction and participate live in person. Thanks for watching.